In the summer of 1821, Shelley was renting a house near Pisa. On the canal that ran behind it, he kept a little boat for exploring the waterways that still run through this fertile part of Italy. He would often set off at dawn. We can imagine him, taking in the tranquil beauty, seeing the workings of the universe in the water that passed him by. What he was writing at the time shows how he saw the cosmos in scientific terms. Atomistic and fluid, driven by natural forces. About a century and a half before the Earth was photographed from space, he had this very image in his mind. Green and azure wanderer, happy globe of land and air. But behind the workings of the material world, he projected the ideal world of the Platonist. The one remains, the many change and pass.
Day has awakened all things that be. The lark and the thrush and the swallow free. The stars burn out in the pale blue air. The thin white moon lies withering there. Thou paradise of exiles, Italy, a heron comes sailing over me. Worlds on worlds are rolling ever from creation to decay, like the bubbles on a river, sparkling, bursting, borne away. Globe of land and air. The one remains, the many change and pass. Life like a dome of many colored glass stains the white radiance of eternity.
Percy Bysshe Shelley was born at Field Place near Horsham in southern England on August the 4th, 1792, the eldest son of the Shelley family. Instinctively generous, he was also imaginative, telling his sisters stories of the great tortoise who lived in the village pond and scaring them with his tales of the old alchemist up in the attic. The local parson taught him Latin and Greek, providing him with his first contact with the classical world. As heir to the family estate, a source of livelihood for many local people, he also grew up to be aware of his station in life. By the oak tree near the stables, he would play whist with his manservant Lucas, and if Lucas held a trump card, he would ask permission to play it. Be I to play trumps, Master Bysshe? This paradise childhood came to an end when he was enrolled in the English public school system. His first school was described by his cousin, Tom Medwin, his contemporary there, as a perfect hell for him. His first years at Eton College, where he was subsequently sent, were little better. As his mind developed, He began to question the orthodox idea of God and was also fascinated by scientific and technological developments. The seeds of the Industrial Revolution had been sown, the energies of the earth were being harnessed, and Shelley's sensitivity to these changes would emerge in the sense of excitement and confidence in his work at humanity's potential. In October 1810, his father took him to Oxford to take up a place at University College, but his stay there was short. After publishing a pamphlet, The Necessity of Atheism, in reality more agnostic than atheist, he was summoned to see the master of the college. "You are expelled," he was told, "and I desire that you quit the college early tomorrow morning at the latest." A small room in Poland Street in Soho became his home. He was 19 years old. The expulsion led to a complete breakdown in relations between Shelley and his family. For legal reasons, however, he could not be disinherited, so Shelley could raise money on his expectations. In effect, he had a good credit rating. In August 1811, he married Harriet Westbrook, the daughter of a London businessman, further widening the gulf between him and his father. However, to protect the estate from his son's borrowings, his father granted him an allowance of £200 a year, and with this Shelley and Harriet embarked on their life together, a life of travel and political activity in Ireland and elsewhere. In the village of Lynmouth in North Devon, he printed a pamphlet, A Declaration of Rights, and published it by sending copies out to sea in bottles and over the Bristol Channel in homemade hot air balloons. These activities were drawn to the attention of the Home Secretary himself, but Shelley was still too young to be prosecuted for sedition. It was at Lynmouth that he started to put his political energies into poetry. His first major poem, Queen Mab, told of how the soul of a sleeping girl is transported above the world, shown the realities of poverty and injustice, but then given a vision of a new world. But after its publication and the birth of his first child, his marriage began to run into difficulties. He and Harriet separated, and while he was staying in London, he met Mary Godwin, the daughter of philosopher William Godwin and feminist pioneer Mary Wollstonecraft, who had died giving birth to her. He sensed that she was his soulmate and suddenly saw his marriage to Harriet as a rash and heartless union. By her mother's grave, Mary declared her love for him, and the marriage to Harriet was effectively over. Shelley tried to rebuild the relationship with her based on friendship rather than on love, but it was impossible. He eloped to Switzerland with Mary, putting the seal on their new life together. When they returned to London, they faced ostracism and renewed money worries. But when Shelley's grandfather died in January 1815, Shelley acquired a sizable income of £1,000 a year. He gave Harriet £200 a year out of this. The following year, he and Mary returned to Switzerland, where Shelley met his famous contemporary and fellow poet, Lord Byron, and where Mary's novel Frankenstein was inspired. Horror crossed from fiction to real life when they returned to England to take up lodgings in Bath. Shelley had returned from a visit to London in high spirits, having made a key friendship with editor Leigh Hunt, who had promised to publish one of his poems. He found a letter waiting for him, informing him of Harriet's suicide. Pregnant and alone, she had drowned herself in the Serpentine in Hyde Park. This was a major crisis for Shelley. Though he never accepted the blame for Harriet's death, it was a reminder that actions had consequences. And Claire Clairmont, Mary's stepsister, who had been with them from the beginning, wrote that he became less wild and impetuous than before. Shelley and Mary were married and made an attempt to settle in Marlow near Oxford, but a year later set out to begin a new life in Italy. But the first years in Italy were marked by personal tragedy. 2 months after arrival, their infant daughter Clara became ill and died. The following summer, their favourite child William became ill in Rome. Shelley stayed by his bedside for 3 days and 3 nights, watching as the little boy slowly lost his fight for life. He wrote, "A swift and hidden spirit of decay that makes its victim, like approaching day, grow more beautiful." Shelley and Mary, now childless, and with Mary in a state of deep depression, left Rome and travelled north to the port of Livorno, where they had friends. It was at this point that a political crisis blew up in Britain. On the 16th of August 1819, there was a meeting in Manchester attended by about 60,000 people calling for parliamentary reform. Fewer than 1 in 100 had the vote. The Home Secretary, Lord Sidmouth, had targeted the main speaker, Henry Hunt, for arrest, and it was while trying to carry this out that the mounted yeomanry knocked down a woman and trampled her child to death. Since arriving in Italy, inspired by the light, the art, the landscape, the visible reminders of Greece and Rome, Shelley had found his creative voice in a way he had never achieved in Britain. Now, in the aftermath of the tragedy in Manchester, which soon became known as the Peterloo Massacre, he used a very direct form of poetry to address the British people.
Your tyrants wear. The seedy sow, another reaps. The wealthy find, another heaps. The robes he weave, another wears. The arms he forge, another bears. Rise like lions after slumber, in unvanquishable number. Shake your chains to earth like dew, which in sleep has fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few. Ye are many, they are few. Ye are many, they are few.
It may have sounded as if Shelley was calling for violent revolution. It was more that he was trying to build up people psychologically and remind them of their own strength and power. It was central to his thinking that indulging the impulse for revenge perpetuated a cycle of violence. And he wrote, "Revenge and wrong bring forth their kind, their foul cubs like their parents are. Their den is in the guilty mind, and conscience feeds them with despair." In a shrewd anticipation of 20th century experience, he saw how violent revolutionaries generally became no better than the tyrants they overthrew. In the months after Peterloo, Shelley tried to put this message into practical political terms. In The Mask of Anarchy, he wrote the first extended piece of non-violent theory in the English language, one that would be quoted 120 years later by Mahatma Gandhi. But in his essay, A Philosophical View of Reform, he conceded that in the end, people could be justified in taking up arms if they had exhausted all peaceful means, if the will of the nation was counteracted by armed force. In September, Shelley and Mary set out for Florence, with Mary expecting another child. It was here that Shelley wrote his finest short lyric, The Ode to the West Wind. His failure to reach an audience, the death of his son William, a recent savage attack on his life and work in a magazine review, the Peterloo massacre itself, and the fact that his hair was starting to go grey, his youth was ending with no sign of his political hopes being achieved. All these were factors influencing the poem. Shelley started going for long walks in the forest of the Cascina on the outskirts of Florence. One afternoon, he found inspiration in the wild spirit of a storm brewing over Florence. The west wind, known to the Greeks as the most bountiful of winds, gave him the central image he needed to unify the many influences that had gathered in his mind. He wrote the first 42 lines of the poem in the forest itself, and when he finished it in his apartment later, he wrote a line in Greek from Euripides beneath it. By virtuous power, I, a mortal, vanquish thee, a mighty God. In an act of mental alchemy, he had taken all the negative and sorry thoughts that had oppressed him and transformed them into a faith in the future of his own work, and a belief that political progress would eventually come as surely as spring follows winter.
In a wood by the river Arno near Florence, on a day when the tempestuous wind was collecting the vapours which pour down the autumnal rains, the locks of the approaching storm.
Wild spirit, which art moving everywhere, destroyer and preserver, here, oh here, a heavy weight of hours has chained and bowed one to like thee, tameless and swift and proud. Oh, wild west wind, thou breath of autumn's being, the leaves are driven like ghosts from an enchanter fleeing, scattered as from an unextinguished heart, ashes and sparks, my words amongst mankind. Moving everywhere, destroyer and preserver, here, oh here, scatter as from an unextinguished heart, ashes and sparks, my words amongst mankind.
The west wind gave Shelley a symbol that would permeate his work over the next 2 years. In the meantime, in Florence, his surge of creativity continued. In the midst of all this, their son, Percy Florence, was born. In the new year they moved to Pisa, and it was here, after years of travelling, that they were to base themselves. For most of the following year, it seemed as if Shelley had burnt himself out creatively. He was involved in money problems, a blackmail attempt against him, and a row with the poet Robert Southey, who accused him of causing Harriet's death. In this year, he produced some minor lyrics, including his song Spirit of Delight, a lament for the spirit's absence and a reminder of the burden of exile.
Rarely, rarely comest thou, Spirit of delight. Wherefore hast thou left me now, many a day and night? Spirit false, thou hast forgot all but those who need thee not. I love all thou lovest, Spirit of delight. The fresh earth in new leaves dressed, and the starry night. Autumn evening and the morn, when the golden mists are born. I love love, though he has wings, and like light can flee. But above all other things, Spirit, I love thee. Thou art life and love, O come, make once more my heart thy home.
As the year 1820 came to an end, Shelley's poetic genius was fired up by a series of random events. The Shelleys were making friends in Pisa, and through their Italian connections, they encountered Tommaso Segrici, an improvisatore, an actor who would improvise a whole evening's entertainment in verse based on a story like Helen of Troy. Shelley wrote, "It seemed as if the imagination of the poet acted without the assistance of the intellect, and he scarcely seemed conscious of the words dictated to him by some superior power." The apparently effortless display of the imagination fascinated him. In addition, the hallucinatory part of his personality reappeared. He was in ill health as the year ended, and his cousin, Tom Medwin, who had recently arrived in Pisa, began putting him into trances in an early form of hypnotherapy. It was then that the Shelleys met a beautiful young Italian woman, Emilia Viviani. She had been placed by her father in a convent to await an arranged marriage, and she inspired Shelley's most passionate poem, Epipsychidion, the song of the soul within the soul. It had the fluidity of Segrici's improvisations and a dreamlike quality that came from his recent trances. There has always been controversy about Epipsychidion. Is it about the women in Shelley's life, or his inner imaginative life? In fact, it works on different levels. Sometimes it talks in symbolic terms about Harriet, the planet of that hour, Emilia, the living sun, and Claire Clairmont, O comet beautiful and fierce, but it also replies to Robert Southey's accusations in philosophical terms, and finally sees in Emilia a spiritualized ideal of beauty that harks back to Dante's love for Beatrice. Mary, who had been referred to as the cold chaste moon, did not like it, calling it Shelley's Italian Platonics and declining to write notes for it when she published Shelley's poetry. Shelley withdrew the poem shortly after publication, but it had geared him up to explore and celebrate the human imagination. His essay, A Defense of Poetry, maintained that the imagination has a social and moral element in that it helps to create empathy between people. Poetry strengthens the moral nature of man as exercise strengthens a limb, he wrote. It could not, however, be called to order. Not even the greatest poet can say, I will now write poetry, for the mind in creation is as a fading coal, which some invisible influence, like an inconstant wind, awakens to transitory brightness. The image of the wind carried over into Adonais, his elegy for John Keats, who had died in Rome of tuberculosis. But now he sounded an ominous note about the perils of that very inspiration, seeing it as blowing the poet away from humanity and the comforting beliefs that people cling to. There is only inspiration and the memory of inspired individuals like Keats there as a guide. The breath whose might I have invoked in song descends on me, my spirit's spark is driven. Far from the shore, far from the trembling throng, whose sails were never to the tempest given, the massy earth and sphered skies are riven. I am borne, darkly, fearfully afar, whilst burning through the inmost veil of heaven. The soul of Adonais burning like a star, beacons from the abode where the eternal are. It was at this point in the summer of 1821 that the Shelleys heard from Lord Byron, then living across the Apennines in Ravenna. He was being manoeuvred out of the city by the local authorities, who feared his influence as a supporter of the embryonic movement for Italian independence. He wanted to consult Shelley as to his next move, so Shelley visited him, and between them they decided that Byron would come to Pisa, and with the help of Shelley's friend, Leigh Hunt, would establish a journal there. Byron's fame virtually guaranteed success, and when news of this reached Britain, alarm bells began to sound amongst government supporters.
It has come to our attention that out in Italy, some young English expatriates have formed a colony. Lord Byron is the leader of this sorry crew, who from now on shall be well known as the Satanic School. I would like to see them on the Judgment Day, even if they repent upon their deathbeds, their sins will not be washed away. Shelley is an atheist, Byron a libertine, and now we hear this sorry pair have planned a magazine. We should not even mention them, but think that it is right, as over an open sewer in the street the watchman hangs a light. Out in Italy, some young English expatriates have formed a colony. Lord Byron is the leader of this sorry crew, who from now on shall be well known as the Satanic School. Beware all young and innocent of the Satanic School. Beware all young and innocent of the Satanic School.
But Hunt was delayed by storms that swept across Europe, and the Pisan circle, Byron, Shelley, and the friends who gathered around them, had no outlet for their energies. Shelley found it difficult to write with the best-selling Byron so close at hand, but in the first months of 1822 he produced a series of love lyrics shot through with delicate melancholy.
I arise from dreams of thee in the first sweet sleep of night, when the winds are breathing low and the stars are shining bright. I arise from dreams of thee and a spirit in my feet has led me, who knows how, to thy chamber window sweet.
We wandered through the pine forest that skirts the ocean's foam. The lightest wind was in its nest, the tempest in its home. How calm it was, the silence then by such a chain was bound, that even the busy woodpecker made it stiller by her sound. Love's passions will rock thee, like the storms rock the ravens on high. Bright reason will mock thee, like the sun from a wintry sky. Though thou art ever fair and kind, the forest's ever green. Less oft is peace in Shelley's mind than calm in waters seen.
In April 1822, the Shelleys and their friends Ned and Jane Williams moved from Pisa, 50 miles up the coast. Their house stood alone on the shore with the sea washing at its front entrance, giving them the impression that they were on board ship. Here, Shelley became subject to a series of mysterious experiences. It was in this potent visionary atmosphere that he began to work on his last major poem, The Triumph of Life. He uses the word triumph in the title, both in the sense of victory and in the sense of the Roman triumph, the victory parade of the conquering general, trailing a ghastly procession of slaves. He was exploring the idea that virtually no one can withstand what he called in Adonais the world's slow stain. Life itself rides the conqueror's chariot, humanity follows in chains. The poem opens with the poet sitting on a hillside overlooking the sea with the sun coming up behind him.
Swift as a spirit, hastening to his task of glory and of good. The sun sprang forth, rejoicing in his splendor. Before me fled the night, behind me rose the day. The deep was at my feet, and heaven above my head, when a strange trance over my fancy grew, which was not slumber. And then a vision on my brain was rolled. Methought I sat beside a public way, thick strewn with summer dust, and a great stream of people there was hurrying to and fro, numerous as gnats upon the evening gleam. Yet none seemed to know whither he went, or whence he came, or why he made one of the multitude. Struck to the heart by this sad pageantry, then what is life? I cried.
Shelley's work does not quite end on his question. He was beginning an answer of which a few words remain. Happy those for whom the fold of... For running right through his work is a belief in human potential and something inside everybody. Not an omnipotent God, but something altogether more tentative that occasionally touches us and could be described as divine.
There is no God, or rather, there is no creative God. The hypothesis of a pervading spirit, co-eternal with the universe, remains unshaken. This power arises from within. Poetry redeems from decay the visitations of the divinity in man. O thou immortal deity, whose throne is in the depth of human thought, I do adjure thy power and thee. Man may be, by all that he is not, by all that he has been, and yet must be.
Before he could finish The Triumph of Life, he was called away. News had arrived that Leigh Hunt had finally arrived in Italy and was waiting for them in Livorno. Shelley sailed down the coast with Ned Williams to settle them into their apartment in Pisa. He was delighted to see his old friend, and yet, as he wrote back to Mary, everyone is in despair and everything in confusion. Byron seemed to be on the point of leaving Tuscany. Leigh Hunt's wife had just been diagnosed as terminally ill, and it looked as if the journal would never get off the ground. But over the next week, endlessly diplomatic, he managed to secure its future. Many years later, Thornton, the son of Leigh Hunt, tried to challenge the emerging Victorian image of Shelley as an angelic and unworldly weakling. He described him in these last days in Pisa, noting his energetic physique, the atmosphere of active movement, vigour and decision that surrounded him, and told how his face changed with every feeling, at times joyful, at times with a touching aspect of sorrow. Shelley, he wrote, stands before the world misconceived because misdescribed, a reminder of how his life was, and still sometimes is, subject to the distortions of prejudice. At 2 in the afternoon on July the 8th, 1822, Shelley and William set out to return to Lerici, watched by their friend Edward Trelawney.
The quarantine officer stopped me and sent me back to the quay. Nonetheless, Shelley and Williams kept heading out to sea. I watched till they disappeared into the haze, then went down to my cabin to sleep. I was woken by thunder and lightning coming crashing down over the deep. And when the storm had cleared away, I looked where their boat had last been. Then I scanned the entire horizon, but they were nowhere to be seen.
With us it was stormy all day, and we did not at all suppose that they could put to sea. Next day it rained and was calm. The sky wept on their graves.
2 weeks on I was cantering over the Mediterranean sands, despair in the pit of my stomach and sweat in the palms of my hands. I was riding along for miles and for miles. I was brought up short when I saw the lifeless body of Shelley lying there on the shore. I rode back to Lerici and there told Mary and Jane that Shelley and Ned had been taken from them by the sea and the wind and the rain. Then I built an iron furnace and carried it down to the shore, prepared the cremation of Shelley as a crowd gathered silent in awe. The air seemed to quiver and glisten twixt the sea and the earth alive. Over his burning body I poured frankincense, salt and wine. My dear Trelawney, said Byron, breaking the funeral spell, I knew that you were a pagan, but you're a pagan priest as well. But not till the evening was on us was his body reduced on the pyre. All was consumed except for his heart, which I snatched from out of the fire. And Mary is left with his papers and a question, she wonders how long it will take for the world to realize what it lost in this bright child of song.
And so it was death by drowning, some 20 miles off Via Reggio, that put an end to the restless search for truth that had dominated Shelley's life. He was 29 years old. As Mary started to come to terms with his death, she began to see Adonais, his elegy for John Keats, as referring to himself. He had based the poem on the Greek myth of Adonis, favourite child and chief hope of the gods, brought low in the prime of life, by the arrow that flies in darkness.
He was a morning star amongst the living. Now that his spirit has fled, he shines in the heavens like the evening star. He gives new splendor to the dead. He has awakened from the dream of life. He hath outsoared the shadow of our night. The soul of Adonais, burning like a star, beacons from the abode where the eternal are.
The spring does not rebel against the winter, it succeeds it. The dawn does not rebel against the night, it disperses it.
The one remains, the many changing paths. Life, like a dome of many colored glass, stains the white radiance of eternity. Oh, wind, if winter comes, can spring be far behind? Oh, wind, can spring be far behind? Oh, wind, if winter comes, can spring be far behind? Oh, wind, can spring be far behind? Oh, wind, if winter comes, can spring be far behind? Oh, wind, can spring be far behind?
About a year before Shelley's death, the first pirated copy of his early poem Queen Mab had appeared. It became his big seller, going into around 30 editions over the next 30 years, circulating amongst the disenfranchised working people of the country, thrilling them with its attacks on superstition and injustice, fascinating them with its vision of humankind transformed. And by the 1850s, the editions of his complete works that Mary Shelley had painstakingly edited had secured his place as one of Britain's greatest poets. Two contending views of him then arose. For a radical Chartist writer, struggling to bring voting rights to Britain, Shelley's work was inspirational and led him to the judgment, the aristocracy of England has not produced a second man of Shelley's stamp. For suffragettes like Sylvia Pankhurst and Millicent Fawcett, the visionary element in his work gave strength in dark times. Can man be free if woman be a slave? Woman and man in confidence and love, equal and free. However, for the critic Matthew Arnold, Shelley was an ineffectual angel beating in the void his luminous wings in vain. But Shelley knew the value of a social and political ideal. Even in exile in Italy, haunted by isolation, and with his work falling stillborn from the press, he still held true to his vision. Be through my lips to an unawakened earth the trumpet of a prophecy. It was a vision cast in secular terms, based on the renunciation of the impulse for revenge. So, the first duty of the reformer, he wrote, was to work for the abolition of capital punishment. He espoused religious toleration, yet believed that religious belief systems would be transient over time. He anticipated today's concerns with human rights, writing, "Governments may burn or imprison those who seek to investigate their principles. It is an invariable sign of their own falsehood." And as Mary Shelley wrote, he was a Republican and loved a democracy. Finally, he saw the overriding aim of society, however difficult it may be, as achieving equality of possessions, believing that a society, a world, without an egalitarian dream becomes fractured. But he would not have countenanced the failed Marxist experiment of achieving it by coercion. Writing, "What men gain fairly, that they may possess, and children may inherit idleness from him that earns it." Some of Shelley's goals have made significant gains since his days. Others remain unfulfilled. His poetry, though, endures as a body of work unique for its poetic wizardry and humanitarian idealism.
The world's great age begins anew, the golden years return. The earth doth like a snake renew, her winter weeds outworn. Heaven smiles and faiths and empires gleam, like wrecks of a dissolving dream. The loathsome mask has fallen, the man remains, king over himself, free from guilt and pain. Women frank and beautiful and kind, looking emotions once they feared to feel, speaking the wisdom once they could not think, change to all which once they dared not be. I dreamed that as I wandered by the way, bare winter suddenly was changed to spring. Let the tyrant rule the desert he has made. Let the free possess the paradise they claim. Where all shall live as equals and as friends, and the world grow young again. Begins anew, the golden years return. The earth doth like a snake